Max stopped before I did. I was still on the other side of the street when he locked up. Not the distracted kind of stop where a dog finds something interesting on the ground. A full-body stop, ears up, eyes fixed on the red brick house to our left. I pulled the leash once. He didn't come. That's when I heard it. It wasn't an argument. Arguments have two sides. What I heard was a single voice. Low, flat, no room for a response. Get your things and get out. The door slammed with the kind of weight that doesn't leave any doubt about what just happened inside. She appeared on the front step holding a small bag, and both hands pressed against her stomach. Pregnant light jacket November. She stood there for a few seconds like her body hadn't received the message yet that it needed to start moving. Then she took a slow breath, came down the steps carefully, and started walking along the sidewalk without looking back. Max looked at me, I looked at her. My name is Thomas Adler. I'm 54 years old, served 18 years in the Army, and learned a long time ago that there are certain things you don't walk past. My ex-wife used to say that was my problem. Maybe she was right. But that morning, with Max pulling gently in the direction of a woman I had never seen before in my life, I only knew one thing. Someone had to stop. I had moved to Millhaven 8 months earlier, in early March, when the town was still caught between winter and something that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be spring. Millhaven sits in a valley in western Virginia, population 4,200, the kind of town that appears on maps as a small dot with a number next to it, that most people don't slow down to read. There's a grain elevator visible from the highway, a diner called Patsy's that has served the same breakfast menu since 1987, and a hardware store run by a man named Gerald, who knows the name of every person who's ever bought a bag of concrete from him and can tell you what they were building. I had come here for the same reason most people end up in towns like Millhaven. I had run out of somewhere else to be. The Army had been my life for nearly 2 decades. I'd enlisted at 22, served 3 tours in 2 different theaters, made it to staff sergeant, and mustered out at 40 with a bad left knee, a functional hearing loss in my right ear that the VA classified as moderate, and the specific kind of tiredness that doesn't come from not sleeping enough, but from having been on alert for so long that the body forgets what it feels like to stand down. My marriage to Carol had lasted 11 years and ended quietly, the way things that have been under pressure for a long time sometimes end, not with a rupture but with a slow release, both of us realizing in the same month that we had been waiting for the other one to be the first to say it. We had no children. That was the part that stayed with me longer than the rest. I had moved 3 times after the divorce. Roanoke, then Charlottesville, then a rental outside Staunton that turned out to have a mold problem the landlord had painted over. Each place had been temporary in the way that a lot of things in my life had been temporary. Fine for now, not quite right, something to be corrected later. When I found the house on Caldwell Street in Millhaven, it felt different in a way I couldn't explain to anyone and didn't try to. It was a small 2-bedroom with a covered porch, a yard big enough for Max to move around in, and a neighborhood where people nodded at each other on the sidewalk and didn't need it to mean anything more than it was. Max had been with me for 6 years. I'd adopted him from a rescue organization outside Fort Lee when he was 2, a black Labrador mix with a broad chest, a gray patch above his left eye that had been spreading slowly over the years, and an even temperament that I'd found useful in the months after the divorce when my own temperament had been less reliable. He was not a trained service dog. He had never been certified for anything. What he was present, consistently, without demand, in the specific way that animals are present when they have decided that a person is their responsibility. I had been taking him on the same morning walk for 8 months, out the front door, east on Caldwell, left on Birch, past the community garden, around the block that had the 2 maple trees the town had apparently been arguing about cutting down for 40 years, and back home. 40 minutes. We did it every morning at 6:30. The red brick house on Birch Street was the 3rd house from the corner on the left side. I had walked past it every morning for 8 months without stopping. That morning Max stopped. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to tell you something about Max that matters to what comes after. Max had been with me through the divorce. He had been with me through the 3 apartments that didn't feel like home, and the night in Charlottesville when I sat on the floor of a rental kitchen at 2 in the morning and couldn't explain to myself why I was sitting there but couldn't seem to move either. He had been with me through the VA appointments and the nights when the hearing in my right ear seemed worse than usual, and I'd lie in the dark convinced that the world was getting quieter around me in a way that wasn't just about sound. He had been present through all of it without requiring anything from me that I couldn't give. Dogs offer that. It is not a small thing. What Max didn't do in 6 years was stop the way he stopped on Birch Street. He had a sense of things. I'd noticed that over the years, the way he'd orient toward a person who was agitated before I'd consciously registered their agitation, the way his head would turn toward a sound before I'd heard it. But he moved through the world with a general equanimity that didn't break into urgency without reason. On Birch Street it broke. I've thought about why. I don't have a scientific explanation and I'm not going to offer one. What I have is the simple fact of what I observed. A dog who had walked past that house on 140 previous mornings without hesitation, who on the 141st morning locked up before anything visible had happened, as if he'd registered something in the quality of the air around that building before the door had even opened. I didn't approach her immediately. I've spent enough time in situations where someone has just had something taken from them to know that the first instinct people have after a shock is usually to get away from wherever it happened. She needed to walk. I let her. Max and I fell into step about half a block behind her. I want to be precise about that. I wasn't following her. I was walking in the same direction she was walking. There's a difference, and it mattered to me. Max understood the distinction in his own way. He matched her pace without any signal from me, not pulling ahead, not lagging, just moving at the same speed through the same morning air. She turned right on Hemlock. Slower now. The bag she was carrying looked heavier than it was. I watched her shift it from one hand to the other and press the free hand back against her stomach. At the corner of Hemlock and Patton, she stopped, put the bag down on the ground, stood with her hands on her knees for a moment, breathing. I stopped too. Max sat without being told. She looked up and saw us. I want to tell you that I said something useful in that moment, something that would have made sense of the situation or made her feel less alone. What actually happened was that she looked at me, then at the dog, and I said, "You all right?" It was the wrong question. She was obviously not all right, but she answered it anyway. "I don't know yet," she said. Her name was Sarah Dowd. She was 31 years old, 34 weeks pregnant, and had been standing in front of that red brick house on Birch Street not because it was her husband's house or her boyfriend's house or any house she had chosen. It was her house. Her name was on the lease. She had paid the rent for 2.5 years. The man who had told her to leave was named Derek Purcell. They had been together for 4 years, and she had believed, for most of that time, that believing in someone was enough to make them into the person you believed they were. She had been wrong about that. Most people who end up wrong about it don't find out until the evidence is too heavy to carry anymore. She told me this in pieces, standing on the corner of Hemlock and Patton with Max sitting beside her and her bag on the ground between her feet. Not all at once, not even close to all of it that morning, but enough. I asked her where she was going. She said she didn't know. I asked if she had family nearby. She said her mother was in Roanoke, but they hadn't spoken in 8 months. I asked if she'd eaten. She said she'd had coffee before everything happened, which was not the same thing as eating, but she didn't seem ready to acknowledge the difference. I said, "There's a diner 2 blocks from here, Patsy's. Best eggs in the valley, and the coffee is terrible. Come sit down." She looked at me for a long moment. "I don't know you," she said. "No," I said. "My name is Thomas. This is Max. We walk past your house every morning. I've never introduced myself, which I should have done months ago, and I'm sorry for that. But I'm asking now." Max looked up at her at that moment. Not a trained look, not a prompted behavior, just the natural movement of a dog whose attention has been on a person since Birch Street and hasn't shifted since. She looked down at him. "He's very calm," she said. "He usually is." She picked up the bag. "Okay," she said, "coffee." Patsy's Diner was the kind of place that had made its peace with being exactly what it was. The booths were red vinyl, the menus were laminated and slightly sticky, and the woman behind the counter, whose name was actually Patsy, which I had assumed was fiction until Gerald, the hardware man, confirmed otherwise, had the focused efficiency of someone who had been watching people have difficult mornings for 30 years, and had developed a precise instinct for when to talk and when to simply put food in front of them. She looked at Sarah when we came through the door, looked at the bag, looked at the stomach, and didn't ask any questions. She put us in the booth in the back corner, brought coffee without being asked, and returned 4 minutes later with a plate of eggs and toast that Sarah hadn't ordered but ate without protest. I watched her eat, and I thought about the kind of courage it takes to sit down in a strange diner with a stranger who has offered you breakfast after the worst morning of your year. It is a specific kind of courage, the kind that looks like nothing from the outside but costs more than most things. She told me the rest of it gradually, over the next 40 minutes. Derek Purcell was not a man who hit things. He was a man who made you feel like hitting things would have been preferable, because at least then there would have been something you could point to. He was a man who made decisions and presented them as facts, who moved money from shared accounts without explanation, who told her she was confused when she described things she had witnessed with her own eyes, who had spent 4 years teaching her, in increments so small she hadn't felt each individual one, that her own perception of reality was not to be trusted. The pregnancy had not been planned. That part she said simply without apology. She had been trying to figure out what to do, not about the baby, she was clear about that, but about Derek, about the apartment, about the shape of a life that had been slowly revised into something she didn't recognize. She had been trying to figure it out carefully and deliberately, the way she did most things. Derek had figured it out first on his own terms, that morning. "He said the lease is in both our names," she said. "That he has as much right to decide who stays as I do. That's not how leases work, I said. I know that now. She said it without self-pity. That was the thing about Sarah Dowd that I noticed from the beginning. She wasn't someone who collapsed into what had happened. She moved through it the way water moves through a crack, finding the path, not because it was easy, but because stopping wasn't something she was going to let herself do. Max had been lying under the table since we'd sat down. At some point during the conversation, he put his chin on her foot. She looked down at him, then back at me. What do I do now? She asked. It was the most honest question I'd heard in a long time. I want to tell you what I know about what it means to have nowhere to go, because I think most people who haven't been there carry a version of it in their heads that isn't quite right. It isn't chaos. That's the thing that surprises people when they think about it carefully. The moments immediately after a door closes on you aren't loud. They're very quiet. Your mind doesn't race. It goes still. And in that stillness, there's a kind of clarity that's almost unbearable. A precise accounting of what you have and what you don't have and what the distance is between those two things. Sarah had $22 in her wallet, a phone with 40% battery, a bag with 3 changes of clothes, her prenatal vitamins, and the documentation folder she'd had the presence of mind to grab on the way out, the one with her lease agreement, her medical records, her pay stubs from the elementary school where she worked as a teaching assistant. She had grabbed that folder in the 20 seconds between Derek telling her to leave and the door closing, which told me something important about the kind of person I was sitting across from. She had been preparing, not for this exact morning maybe, but for something like it. I called my neighbor Margaret first. Margaret Okafor was 67 years old, had raised 4 children in Millhaven, and had the particular authority of a woman who has seen enough of the world to be unimpressed by most of its emergencies. I had helped her move a washing machine 2 months earlier. She owed me nothing. I called her anyway. She picked up on the second ring. Thomas, she said. I have a situation, I said. Young woman, 34 weeks along, got put out of her apartment this morning by her partner. She has documentation. She needs a place to sit and make phone calls and not be outside. There was a pause of about 2 seconds. Bring her over, Margaret said. I'll put the kettle on. That's the thing about small towns that the people who've never lived in one don't know. The social infrastructure is visible. You can see it. You know where it lives. Margaret's house on Pecan Street became, for the next 6 hours, the operational center of something that didn't have a name, but functioned like a plan. Margaret sat with Sarah at the kitchen table while Sarah made calls. The first was to the Virginia Legal Aid Society, which had a tenant rights hotline. The person on the other end explained to Sarah, in careful detail, that her name on the lease gave her the same right to occupancy as Derek's name, that his telling her to leave did not constitute a legal eviction, and that returning to the apartment was within her rights. Sarah listened to all of this with her pen moving steadily across the notepad Margaret had set beside her coffee cup. The second call was to the Millhaven Police Department, not to report a crime but to ask a question. If she returned to the apartment and Derek refused to let her in, what were her options? The officer she spoke to, a woman named Reyes, was straightforward. She had rights. If there was a problem, she could call and someone would come. The third call was to her doctor's office. 34 weeks, the stress of the morning, she needed to check in. I sat in Margaret's living room with Max while these calls happened. Max lay on the rug and watched the doorway to the kitchen, with the patient attention of a dog who has decided that the person in the next room is the most important thing in his immediate environment. Margaret came out at one point and sat in the chair across from me. She's something, she said. She is, I said. What are you going to do about the man? I had been thinking about that. Derek Purcell came home at 4:15 in the afternoon. I know this because I was sitting on the front steps of the red brick house on Birch Street when he pulled up. Max was beside me. Sarah was inside. She had returned to the apartment at 2 o'clock with Officer Reyes present, and Derek had not been there. She had changed the lock. It was, Officer Reyes had confirmed, within her legal rights as the named tenant. Derek drove a gray pickup and parked it in a way that suggested he was a man who assumed parking spaces were his by default. He got out, saw me, and stopped. He was bigger than I'd expected, broad, the kind of build that some men use as a first sentence in every conversation. Who are you? He said. Thomas Adler, I said. I live on Caldwell. What are you doing on my steps? They're not your steps, I said. The lease is in Sarah's name and in yours. You have equal right to the space. You don't have the right to remove her from it. He looked at me the way men look at obstacles. Calculating. Measuring. This is none of your business, he said. You made it my business when you put a pregnant woman on the sidewalk this morning, I said. I watched it happen. Max stood up beside me. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply rose to his feet and oriented his body toward Derek with the quiet precision of an animal that has made an assessment and arrived at a conclusion. There are men who, when confronted with a large, calm dog who is looking directly at them, recalibrate. Derek was one of them. I want you off my property, he said. I'll leave when Sarah tells me to, I said. She's inside. You're welcome to knock. He stood at the bottom of the steps for a long moment. Then he got back in the truck. I don't know where he went that night. I didn't follow him and I didn't ask. What I knew was that he left, and that the door to the red brick house on Birch Street stayed closed, and that the light in the second-floor window stayed on. I have been asked over the years what it means to leave the military after 18 years. It is not a question with a clean answer. What you carry out is not just the training. The training is the visible part, the physical responses, the situational awareness, the specific way you hold a room in your peripheral vision without appearing to be doing it. Those things stay. But what also stays, less visibly, is the ethic that the training was built around. Not the one that gets described in recruitment brochures. The real one, the one that gets clarified under pressure, that your obligation is to the people next to you first, and to the mission second, and that the two are usually the same thing, but on the occasions when they diverge, you have to know which one you serve. I had spent 18 years making that choice automatic. When I left, I hadn't known what to do with the automaticity, when there was no longer a context for it. That was, I think, part of what had gone wrong with Carol. Not the only part, but a part. I had been trained to protect and to respond and to hold a position, and in a marriage those things look like something different than they do in a theater of operations, and I had not always been able to make that translation cleanly. But on the corner of Hemlock and Patton on a November morning, watching a woman in a light jacket with her hands on her stomach set down a bag that was too heavy for her, the translation was not required. Some situations speak the same language regardless of where you learned it. Max had understood that before I did. He always does. I want to stop here and tell you something about the way that small towns actually work, because I think the way people imagine small towns and the way they function are often two different things. People who have never lived in one tend to imagine either the idealized version, neighbors who bring casseroles without being asked, communities that form naturally around need, or the cynical version, the one where everyone knows your business and uses it. Both of those versions exist. What people miss is the mechanism underneath them. In a small town, the social infrastructure is not invisible the way it is in a city. You can see it. You know which people organize and which people show up, and which people provide resources and which people prefer to stay back. You know who has dealt with hard things and come out the other side with their judgment intact, and who hasn't. You know who to call. I had been in Millhaven for 8 months. 8 months is not a long time, but I had paid attention. I had shown up at things. The community garden planning meeting in April, the hardware store conversation that turned into an hour about the history of the valley, the Patsy's counter on mornings when the booth was full. I had let myself be known in the specific way that you have to let yourself be known in a new place if you want it to become home. Not by explaining yourself, but by being present, consistently, over time, until your presence accumulates into something recognizable. When I called Margaret that morning, she picked up on the second ring. That was not an accident. That was 8 months of showing up, rendered visible in a single answered call. The weeks after that morning moved in the specific way that practical crises move. Not dramatically, but steadily, one thing after another, each small action connecting to the next. Sarah filed a formal complaint with the Virginia Legal Aid Society, documenting the unlawful removal. With their help, she applied for an emergency protective order, which was granted 11 days after that morning, based on a documented pattern of financial control, psychological coercion, and the events of November 14th. Derek Purcell vacated the apartment on Birch Street 23 days later, in accordance with the terms of the order. What I want to tell you about the confrontation with Derek Purcell is not the dramatic version. The dramatic version would have a raised voice, a threat delivered, a man backing down in a way that felt like justice with a shape to it. What actually happened was quieter than that and in some ways harder. Derek was not a monster in the way that word is usually used. He was a man who had been allowed over years to be the kind of man he was, and who had therefore never developed the machinery for being a different kind. He looked at Sarah and saw something he owned. He looked at her pregnancy and saw a complication in his life. He looked at the apartment where she had lived for 2.5 years and saw a resource he had decided to reallocate. These were not the thoughts of a monster. They were the thoughts of a man who had never once been required to account for the cost of himself, to the people around him. When he saw me on his steps, on her steps, he was surprised in the way that men like him are usually surprised when someone declines to move. He was used to the social machinery producing compliance. When it didn't, he had to recalibrate. I watched him do it. It wasn't fast. Max standing beside me helped. I want to be honest about that. Max is not a threatening dog in any conventional sense. He doesn't bark. He doesn't lunge. He doesn't show his teeth. What he does is stand with a quality of presence that is impossible to dismiss. He had assessed Derek in the first 3 seconds and arrived at a conclusion, and the conclusion was visible in every line of his body. Derek read it clearly. He left, and I sat back down on the steps and waited until the light came on upstairs. I am not going to tell you that this was easy. It was not. There were days when Sarah called me from the apartment because she had heard a noise outside and needed someone to know where she was. There were days when the legal process moved slowly enough that patience felt like something being extracted from her by force. There were nights when I sat on my porch with Max and thought about the specific arithmetic of what one person's cruelty costs another person in time and money and sleep and confidence, and felt a cold anger that I had learned, over 18 years in the army, to keep at a temperature I could use. Margaret cooked. That was her way. Every 2 or 3 days she appeared at Sarah's door with something. Soup, cornbread, a casserole in a dish she'd had since 1994. She never made a production of it. She just brought food and stayed long enough to confirm that the person she'd brought it to was still standing. Patsy at the diner started keeping a booth available on Tuesday mornings, which became the time Sarah and I had coffee. Not by arrangement exactly, just by repetition, which is how most of the reliable things in a life get established. Gerald from the hardware store, when I mentioned in passing that Sarah's apartment had a window latch that didn't seat properly, arrived the following Saturday with a toolbox and fixed it in 20 minutes and refused any payment. He said he had a daughter about Sarah's age who lived in Richmond, and that he didn't think about it much because he preferred not to, but that when a situation was clear, a situation was clear. Max went with me every time I visited. He had established by the second week a habit of lying with his head in Sarah's lap on the couch while she worked through paperwork, which he had stopped trying to discourage because she said it made the paperwork feel less like paperwork. I watched him with her and thought about what it means for a dog to choose someone. Not the way dogs are trained to choose, not out of conditioning or command, but the way Max had chosen Sarah on a sidewalk on a November morning, out of some process of assessment that I couldn't map but had learned not to question. He had made a decision on Birch Street. He had been executing it ever since. Lily Rose Dowd was born on the 29th of December at 6:47 in the morning at Millhaven General Hospital. I was in the waiting room. Margaret was there too, in the chair next to mine, with a thermos of coffee and a calm on her face that I had come to understand was not the absence of feeling but the management of it. The specific stillness of a woman who has been through enough to know that worry doesn't change outcomes, and that the most useful thing you can do while waiting is simply to be present. Max was at home. Hospitals have rules. He had seemed to understand this when I left him. There was a quality to how he watched me go out the door that morning that I can only describe as attentive. He knew something was happening. He accepted that his part in it, for the moment, was to wait. Lily Rose Dowd was born on the 29th of December at 6:47 in the morning at Millhaven General Hospital. I was in the waiting room. Margaret was there too, in the chair next to mine, with a thermos of coffee and a calm on her face that I had come to understand was not the absence of feeling but the management of it. The specific stillness of a woman who has been through enough to know that worry doesn't change outcomes, and that the most useful thing you can do while waiting is simply to be present. Max was at home. Hospitals have rules. He had seemed to understand this when I left him. There was a quality to how he watched me go out the door that morning that I can only describe as attentive. He knew something was happening. He accepted that his part in it, for the moment, was to wait. I thought about that while I sat in the waiting room, about what it costs an animal to wait for something it cares about and doesn't fully understand. Max had been oriented towards Sarah since November. In the 6 weeks between that morning on Birch Street and the morning of December 29th, he had developed a set of behaviors around her that I had never prompted and couldn't fully explain. He checked the door when she arrived before I did. He settled differently when she was in the room, not excitedly, not with performance, but with a kind of settled attention that I can only describe as deliberate. He had filed her under something important and was treating the filing accordingly. Leaving him behind that morning had felt like leaving a partner behind, which was not a feeling I had expected from dropping a dog off at a neighbor's house with a water bowl and half a cup of kibble. Margaret looked at me at one point and said, "You're worried." "I'm always worried," I said. "About her, I mean, not just the medical part." I thought about that. "She came out of that apartment on a November morning with her documentation folder," I said. She had grabbed it before he finished talking. She'd been building toward that exit for longer than she knew. "That's not the same as being ready for what comes after," Margaret said. "No," I said, "it isn't." We sat with that for a while. Sarah had asked me the night before if I would be there. She said it simply, without the weight that question might have had under different circumstances. I said I would be there. She said thank you in the way that people say thank you when they mean something larger than the 2 words contain. The doctor who came out to the waiting room at 7:15 was a woman named Calderon, who had the delivery room efficiency of someone who has been delivering babies in a valley town long enough to have delivered some of their children. She told us that Sarah was well and that the baby was well and that they were both resting. Margaret put her hand over mine. "There it is," she said. "I have been in rooms where people received news they had been afraid was going to be different. In the army, I was in some of those rooms more times than I want to count. I know what relief sounds like when it sits down all at once in a human body." I sat with it for a moment, then I said, "I should call Max." Margaret looked at me. You can't call a dog, Thomas. I know, I said. I just wanted something to do. She laughed. It was a good sound in a waiting room. Sarah brought Lily home to the apartment on Birch Street on New Year's Eve. The protective order was still in effect. Derek Purcell had, as far as anyone knew, relocated to a cousin's property in West Virginia. The apartment was quiet in the way that apartments become quiet, when the thing that was wrong about them has been removed. I drove them home from the hospital. Margaret was there when we arrived. She had been there since 8 in the morning, which she did not mention, but the evidence was the cleaned kitchen, and the flowers on the table, and the casserole in the oven that had been timed to come out 40 minutes after our arrival. Sarah carried Lily through the front door and stopped in the entryway for a moment, the way people stop when they're letting a place register. Max was sitting 3 feet inside the door. I had let him in ahead of us, which I'd done deliberately, because I wanted to know what he would do before Sarah and the baby came in. He had gone directly to the entryway and sat down, not with agitation, not with the particular alertness he had shown on Birch Street in November, with something quieter than that. Sarah came through the door with Lily. Max leaned forward and put his nose within 2 inches of the baby's face. He held it there for 3 seconds, not touching, just present in the specific way he was present with things he was deciding about. Then he sat back, looked up at Sarah, and his tail moved once. Slowly. Sarah looked down at him for a long moment. "You're going to take this seriously, aren't you?" she said. Max looked at the baby. I stood in the doorway of that apartment on the last day of December and thought about what it means for a life to turn. Not dramatically, not the way stories sometimes suggest it turns, with a single moment that reorganizes everything, but gradually, the way a road curves. You're on one heading, and then you're on another, and the distance between them is a series of small decisions made by people and animals who decided that leaving was not what they were going to do. I had come to Millhaven 8 months earlier with a bad knee and a quieter version of myself than I'd started with, looking for somewhere that would stay still long enough for me to figure out what came next. I had found, in the 8 months since, that what came next rarely announces itself in advance. It tends to appear the way Max appeared on the corner of Birch and Hemlock, by stopping and waiting and refusing to walk past. Millhaven is still a town of 4,200. The grain elevator is still visible from the highway. Patsy's still serves the same breakfast menu and the coffee is still terrible, and that has never once stopped anyone from ordering it. Lily Rose Dowd is, by all available evidence, a person who arrived in the world with her mother's directness and her own opinions about things. She is not yet 4 months old, and has already communicated clearly that she has preferences about the angle at which she is held, the specific timbre of voices in the room, and the proximity of a certain black Labrador mix, who takes his self-assigned responsibilities with great seriousness. Max sleeps outside her door on the night Sarah asks me to stay late, not because anyone told him to, not because there was a command given or a behavior trained. He found a door that needed watching, and he watches it. In the unhurried way he does everything that matters to him. Sarah is back at work 3 days a week. She is in the process of having her name removed from the joint lease and re-signed as sole tenant, which the landlord, a man named Birch, who had heard what happened through the ordinary machinery of a small town, facilitated without resistance and with what appeared to be relief. He had not known what was happening inside that apartment. He said so directly, without defensiveness, and I believed him. Most people don't know what's happening inside the places they own. That is not always an excuse, but in Birch's case it appeared to be simply true. Sarah does not talk much about Derek, not because she is carrying it silently in a way that concerns me, but because she has made a deliberate decision about what gets her attention and what doesn't, and Derek Purcell has been moved to a category that doesn't merit much of it. This is not indifference. This is what clear-headedness looks like in a person who has had to buy it at some cost. She has, in the months since November, developed an economy of attention that I find quietly remarkable. She spends it on Lily, on the kids in her classroom, on the legal process that is still working its way through the system at the speed of legal processes everywhere, which is to say, not quickly. She does not spend it on anger, which is not because the anger isn't there, but because she has found better uses for what it costs. I have not asked Sarah about the future. That is not a conversation she needs from me right now, and I don't have a clear picture of what my own future holds, which makes me an uncertain guide to anyone else's. What I know is that Caldwell Street is home in a way that I haven't had a home in a long time, that Margaret's kettle has been on for me more times than I've counted, that Patsy keeps a booth available on Tuesdays. I know that the specific kind of tiredness I carried out of the army has been changing in a way I don't have precise language for, getting lighter in some places, settling differently in others, redistributing itself across a life that has more people in it than it did 8 months ago. I don't know if that is recovery or just change. I've decided it doesn't matter which word fits. What matters is the direction, and that on the morning walk, when we turn left on Birch, Max does not pass the red brick house at the third door from the corner without slowing down. He checks it every time. In the careful way he checks things he has decided are his concern. He looks at the door. He looks at the window. He checks that the light is on.
It always is.
Every year in the United States, more than 10 million people experience domestic violence. Of that number, a significant portion, researchers estimate between 30 and 40% in various studies, are pregnant or have recently given birth at the time the violence occurs or escalates. Pregnancy does not protect women from intimate partner violence. In many documented cases, it precedes the period of greatest risk. The National Domestic Violence Hotline operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at 1-800-799-7233. They provide crisis intervention, safety planning, and referrals to local services. Calls are confidential. Text-based support is also available for those who cannot speak safely. Tenant rights vary by state, but in most jurisdictions, a named tenant cannot be legally removed from a residence without a formal eviction process, regardless of the relationship between the parties. Verbal orders to leave, regardless of who delivers them or under what circumstances, do not constitute legal eviction. Sarah Dowd is a composite character. The circumstances of her situation, including the legal tools available to her, the community response she received, and the role played by a dog who made a decision on a cold November morning, reflect real patterns documented in real cases across the United States. The names are changed. The possibility is not.